All right, Beyond, let's talk justice. Think about this. You have what seems like a pretty open and shut drug bust, right? People get convicted, seems straightforward. But then years down the line, the Supreme Court steps in and completely overturns everything. Those convicted walk free.
Wow.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What does a turn of events like that tell us about how incredibly important it is to be absolutely meticulous, no room for error when it comes to handling evidence? And not just that, but the unwavering commitment to due process that our justice system demands, especially when we're dealing with serious accusations. Welcome to the deep dive.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going deep into a Supreme Court case that really sent ripples through the legal community here in the Philippines, a case that a lot of people have been talking about.
Yeah, it really got people's attention, and for good reason. I mean, this deep dive takes us straight to the core of Republic Act number 9165, the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act of 2002. We're going to be dissecting it by examining this really compelling legal battle that ended with a powerful statement from the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court, about the absolute essentials of handling drug cases.
Exactly. We're zeroing in on the Supreme Court resolution on the motion for reconsideration in People of the Philippines via Allan Almayda Selfides and Homero Quiogue Adornado. That's GR number 27706, dated June 14th, 2023. We're on a mission, a crucial one, to understand why the Supreme Court did a complete 180, reversed its initial decision, and acquitted the accused. And the heart of it all, as we'll see, lies in this concept, this legal cornerstone called the chain of custody.
Yeah, that's the crux of the matter.
So let's break it down piece by piece. What exactly happened in this case? What were the facts?
Well, it all started with this information, the formal accusation dated April 20th, 2012. Allan Almayda and Homero Quiogue were charged with selling shabu, that's methamphetamine hydrochloride, in Legazpi City. This happened on April 19th, 2012.
Okay.
The prosecution claimed they sold 2 tiny little sachets of what they alleged was shabu. One weighed a mere 0.318 gram, the other even smaller, just 0.072 gram, for a total of P$4,500 to an undercover police officer.
Sounds like your classic buy-bust operation. Walk us through how the authorities say they carried this whole thing out.
Sure. So PDEA, Region V, the Philippine Drug Enforcement Agency, they organized this buy-bust operation based on a tip they got about Quiogue and this other person who was later identified as Almayda.
Okay.
Seems like an informant helped set up a meeting, initially for a smaller amount of shabu, but Almayda, according to the report, insisted on a minimum purchase price of P$4,500. They agreed to meet the next day at a restaurant called 7th Inn's Bululuhan.
So the stage is set, right? We're at the restaurant. What does the prosecution say went down?
So according to the prosecution's account, Almayda hands over these 2 sachets that supposedly contain shabu to Agent Daniel Tan, who's playing the role of the poser buyer, pretending to be interested in buying. Agent Tan then pays Almayda with the marked money, the money they use in these operations, and Almayda, in turn, passes this money to Quiogue.
Right.
And that's when Agent Tan gives the signal to the rest of the PDEA team. They move in, and Almayda and Quiogue are arrested. They found the marked money on Quiogue, and Agent Tan, right there on the spot at the restaurant, marks the sachets that were seized.
Marking the evidence right there, that sounds like a smart move, Makes sense, right. Preserve the integrity of the evidence from the get-go. But hold on, what happened next? What happened after they made the arrest?
This is where things take an interesting turn. It gets a bit complicated and, as it turns out, becomes super important to the Supreme Court's final decision. So they marked the sachets there at 7th Inn, right? But the inventory of everything they seized and the photographs standard procedure, right? In drug cases, they didn't do those things there.
Interesting.
They all went to the PDEA regional office, the arrested individuals, the whole PDEA team. It's at the office, not at that restaurant where the alleged sale went down, that they do the inventory and take the photographs.
Okay.
They did this in front of Almayda and Quiogue, of course, and also representatives from the barangay, the media, and a DOJ representative. Later on, they tested the substances in those sachets at the PNP crime laboratory and confirmed that it was, in fact, methamphetamine hydrochloride.
So things didn't go down exactly as you'd expect, right? You'd think they'd document everything at the scene itself. What was the defense's side of this whole story? Must have been pretty different given how things turned out.
Yeah, their story was a complete 180. Almayda and Quiogue said they were just at 7th Inn because Almayda had been at a court hearing earlier that day. They said that PDEA agents came up to them at the restaurant and basically asked them to go to Camp Ola, a military camp, for some questioning.
Okay.
But then, they said, the agents handcuffed them and took their belongings. They completely denied selling any illegal drugs.
So we've got 2 completely different versions of what happened. Let's talk about how the lower courts handled these conflicting stories. What did the regional trial court decide?
The trial court sided completely with the prosecution. They found Almayda and Quiogue guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. They put a lot of stock in the testimonies of those PDEA agents, working under this legal idea that law enforcement officers are doing their duty and don't have any bad intentions,
Right.
Really important here is that the trial court decided that the prosecution had done enough to establish a solid chain of custody for the drugs. And because of all this, they hit Almayda and Quiogue with a very harsh sentence, life imprisonment. And each of them had to pay a fine of 1 million pesos.
Wow, that's a huge sentence. What did the Court of Appeals, the next step in the process, did they see things differently?
The Court of Appeals, they went over the trial court's decision really carefully, but in the end, they decided to uphold it. They basically agreed with everything the trial court had decided and threw out all the arguments Almayda and Quiogue made, including their claims about problems with the chain of custody.
So they go through two courts and both find them guilty. That really highlights how crucial the Supreme Court's involvement became. What was the specific legal question that the Supreme Court had to tackle in this case?
The main issue, the one the Supreme Court really wrestled with, was whether the prosecution had actually proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, an unbroken chain of custody for the seized drugs. They were really focused on those very first steps, the critical ones, when the drugs were actually seized, how they were marked right then and there, and then, super important, the inventory and the photographs.
Got it.
They were looking at whether those things were done exactly according to the rules laid out in Republic Act 9165. You can't mess those up.
And initially, the Supreme Court agreed with the lower courts, right?
Yeah, you're right. In their first resolution, which came out on November 11, 2021, they upheld the conviction from the lower courts. But that wasn't the end of it.
It wasn't. What happened?
Almayda and Quiogue, they filed what's called a motion for reconsideration, basically asking the Supreme Court to take another look, to really examine their case one more time.
And that motion turned out to be the game changer. What was it about that reconsideration that made the Supreme Court do a complete U-turn and reverse their initial decision?
Well, on June 14th, 2023, the Supreme Court issued the resolution on that motion. They decided to grant the motion for reconsideration. They acquitted Allan Almayda and Homero Quiogue.
Wow.
That reversal, it all came down to this really fundamental legal principle, this crucial first link in the chain of custody.
Right.
They said, and they emphasized this, that immediately seizing and marking those drugs right there at the spot where the arrest happens, that's absolutely essential. And then what has to follow right after is the physical inventory and taking pictures. Ideally, all of that happens in the same place. And critically, all of this has to be done with the accused present, or if they have one, their lawyer. And there are these specific witnesses that have to be there. An elected public official, a representative from the DOJ, and someone from the media.
So the fact that they didn't do that inventory and the photographs at the restaurant at 7th Inn where they said the sale happened, that was the issue, right?
That's exactly it. The Supreme Court, in their decision, specifically referenced a case they decided not too long ago, People v. Casa, that's GR number 254208, March 13th, 2023. In that Casa case, the Supreme Court said that, yes, there are some very specific situations where doing the inventory and taking pictures right there at the place where you see something might not be possible right away, like if it's dangerous or you can't do it for some practical reason.
Okay.
In those cases, it's okay to do those things at the closest police station or PDEA office. And this is a huge, but the officers who are involved, they have to explain very clearly in their official reports why they didn't follow the standard procedure, why they had to move things to a different location. There has to be a good reason.
Makes sense. And in the case of Almayda and Quiogue, what was the missing piece? Why did the court overturn the convictions?
Okay, so Agent Tan, he said he did mark those sachets at the restaurant, 7th Inn, right. But he didn't give any reason, no justification at all for why they did the inventory and took the pictures later at the PDEA office instead of doing it right there where they made the arrest, where they said the crime happened.
Okay.
The Supreme Court was very clear. They said this failure to follow the required procedure for that very first step in the chain of custody, that was a major problem, a fatal flaw in the prosecution's case.
So it's like they were saying, if you mess up that first step, you can't fix it later on no matter what you do.
Yeah, exactly. They even brought up another case, People v. Ismail, to really drive home that point. A serious lapse or something that's not explained in those very first stages of the chain of custody that casts doubt on the whole thing, the integrity of the drugs, whether those are even the drugs that were seized. Even if you do everything perfectly from that point on, it doesn't matter. That first mistake can't be fixed. And because of that procedural error, the court said, look, the prosecution didn't prove the corpus delicti. That's Latin for the body of the crime. And in drug cases, that means the actual drugs themselves. They didn't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's the standard we have to meet in our legal system.
It sounds like a really strong message from the Supreme Court to law enforcement, you know, don't mess around with those procedures, especially in drug cases.
Oh, absolutely. They cited People v. McCood in their decision to highlight just how important it is to be super vigilant in drug cases to protect everyone's constitutional rights. They warned about the risk of, getting so caught up in fighting drugs that we end up sacrificing fundamental rights. They reminded all the lower courts to be very, very careful to make sure they don't convict innocent people. And that's why they granted the Onying motion for reconsideration, overturned their earlier decision to uphold the convictions, and ordered the immediate release of Allan Almayda and Homero Quiogue. They even sent copies of their resolution to the Bureau of Corrections, the Philippine National Police, and PDEA, making it clear that they need to know about this and follow it.
So a total reversal, all because of a very specific procedural issue. It really shows how crucial it is to follow the law to the letter, even when we think we're doing the right thing.
It really does. It's a huge reminder that due process, it's not just some technicality, some formality. It's a fundamental right that everyone has, and it has to be protected carefully and rigorously in every single case.
This case, with its really strict chain of custody requirements, what does it tell you about how much the prosecution has to prove in drug cases, and maybe even more broadly, about the right to due process that every single person has, no matter what they're accused of? It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It really does. It's something for everyone to think about. What are your thoughts on this really important part of how our justice system handles evidence? We want to know. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive helpful, hit that favorite button. Let us know you're out there.
Before we wrap things up, let's take a minute to go over some of those key legal ideas that were really at the center of this case. They're important.
Right. So first up, chain of custody. We've talked about it a lot today. This is basically the official record of where the seized drugs or any controlled substances have been, who's had them, from the moment they were seized all the way to when they're presented in court. It's all about making sure those drugs are the real deal and that they haven't been tampered with.
Next, we have Section 21 of Republic Act 9165. This part of the Comprehensive Dangerous Drugs Act, it lays out very specific procedures that have to be followed when the drugs are first seized, when they're in custody. That means doing the inventory right away, taking pictures right there where they seize the drugs, and they have to have those specific witnesses there too.
And then there's corpus delicti. That's a fancy Latin term that means the body of the crime. In drug cases, it means the actual drugs that were taken. And the prosecution, they have to prove with no doubt that those are the actual drugs.
And lastly, we can't forget the big one, the presumption of innocence. This is the foundation of our justice system. It means everyone who's accused of something, no matter what it is considered innocent until the prosecution proves they're guilty. And that proof has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. This case really highlights how important that idea is.
If you want to stay up to date on important legal stuff like this and really understand the things that shape our society, make sure you hit that subscribe button for the deep dive. We're all about going deeper, looking at the stories behind the headlines, and giving you the context and insights you need. We go way beyond just scratching the surface.
Subscribe now so you don't miss out on any more deep dives into the things that really matter.